In 1981, a software engineer in Seattle sold the foundation of Microsoft's empire for $50,000. He had no idea who he was selling it to. He didn't know the buyer was about to hand it to IBM. He didn't know that the same code he wrote in 4 months would one day sit inside 1 billion machines. He found out later. By then, the check had cleared. That same year, another man, the one who had already built the operating system that inspired the whole thing, sat down with IBM representatives and watched a deal fall apart. Exactly why it fell apart has been argued about for 40 years. What is not argued is what happened next. IBM left his office without a contract. Within 18 months, his life's work had been priced off the market by the very company that had come to license it. One of these men died at 52. Forgotten. Broken ways that weren't about money. The other is still alive, says he has no significant regrets, and made somewhere around $20 million from work he sold for $50,000. Bill Gates became the richest person on Earth. Neither of these men is in Microsoft's official history. Neither is taught in schools. And in a few minutes, I am going to show you the specific contract clause, a single sentence IBM's lawyers failed to catch. That explains why Microsoft controls an industry it did not actually invent. But first, you need to know who these two men were, because without them, there is no Microsoft. There is no Windows. There is none of it. On July 27, 1981, Microsoft purchased full ownership of an operating system called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, for $50,000 total. That is the complete payment, $50,000. The man who wrote it received his share of that. Microsoft took what it bought, renamed it MS-DOS, licensed it to IBM as PC-DOS, and used it as the foundation for every version of Windows that followed. Microsoft is today valued at over $3 trillion. The company was built on a product it purchased for less than the price of a mid-range car in 1981. That is not the most extraordinary part. The most extraordinary part is what Microsoft did not tell the seller. Tim Patterson, the engineer who wrote QDOS, was an employee at a small company called Seattle Computer Products. When Microsoft came to buy his operating system, they never disclosed who the end customer was. Patterson and his employer had no idea the buyer was about to hand their work to IBM. Rod Brock, who owned Seattle Computer Products, said later that had he known, the price would have been dramatically different. He was not wrong. And there is a third number worth knowing. When IBM began selling its personal computer in 1981, it offered 2 operating systems. The one Microsoft supplied, PC-DOS, was priced at $40. The competing system, CP/M, the operating system that had dominated personal computing for the previous 6 years, was priced at $240 on the same machine. IBM priced its own preferred system at 6 times the cost of the competition. That is not a market outcome. That is a market decision. And the man who built CP/M had no say in it. His name was Gary Kildall. And what happened to him is one of the most consequential, untold stories in the history of technology. In 1974, Kildall created CP/M, Control Program for Microcomputers. This was not a hobbyist project. This was the first serious, commercially viable operating system for personal computers. It ran on the Intel 8080 processor. It established the fundamental architecture, the logical structure that all subsequent personal computer operating systems would follow. The concept of a file system accessible to any program. The idea of a layer between hardware and software. The BIOS, Basic Input-Output System, the firmware that allows a computer's operating system to communicate with its hardware. Kildall invented the BIOS. Every computer made since then uses it, in some form, at its core. He founded a company called Digital Research Inc., and by the late 1970s, CP/M was the dominant operating system in personal computing. Thousands of software titles were written for it. Businesses ran on it. If you owned a personal computer in 1979, there was a strong chance it ran CP/M. Gary Kildall was, by any reasonable measure, the most important software engineer in personal computing before IBM entered the market. Now consider what was happening on the other side of the story. Bill Gates was 25 years old in 1980. Microsoft was a programming language company. It made basic interpreters. It did not make operating systems. When IBM came to Microsoft looking for an OS to power its new personal computer, the IBM PC, Gates did not have one. He referred IBM to Gary Kildall at Digital Research. That referral is documented. IBM went to see Kildall. What happened next is where the story gets complicated, and where, for decades, Kildall got blamed for something that is far less clear-cut than the popular version suggests. We will get to exactly what happened in that meeting. But there is something else you need to understand first about the man IBM walked away from, because the decision IBM made that day was not just about one meeting. It was about a negotiation that IBM was not prepared to handle fairly. And that matters. The IBM meeting at Digital Research has become one of the most distorted stories in technology history. The popular version, repeated in books, documentaries, and countless articles, is that Gary Kildall went flying in his private plane and missed the meeting. That version has been called, by Kildall's own family, the biggest whopper in computer history. Here is what the available evidence actually supports. IBM arrived at Digital Research in Pacific Grove, California in the summer of 1980. Kildall may have been flying that morning. This part is genuinely disputed. What is documented is that IBM's representatives presented an extraordinarily one-sided non-disclosure agreement. Dorothy Kildall, Gary's wife and business partner, and the company's lawyers refused to sign it. That was a legitimate legal decision. The NDA was not a standard document. IBM also wanted to pay a flat fee for the right to use CP/M. Digital Research wanted royalties. This was a significant commercial disagreement. Gary Kildall himself later wrote that he met IBM representatives on a flight to Florida that evening and reached what he believed was a handshake agreement. IBM's main negotiator, Jack Sams, said he never actually met Gary during this process. The accounts do not reconcile. What is certain is this. IBM left Digital Research without a contract. IBM went back to Gates. Gates had been making inquiries. He had learned that a small company in Seattle Computer Products, had an operating system sitting on the shelf. An engineer there named Tim Patterson had built it in 4 months. It was designed specifically to run CP/M software on newer Intel hardware. It was called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. The name was not a selling point. The price was. Microsoft licensed QDOS for $10,000 plus $15,000 per company its sub licensed it to. Then, shortly after confirming IBM as the customer, while still telling nobody at Seattle Computer Products who that customer was, Microsoft bought the full rights outright for $50,000. IBM signed the deal, and IBM's lawyers missed a clause that would define the next 4 decades of computing. The clause was simple. IBM believed it had an exclusive arrangement. It did not. Microsoft had negotiated a non-exclusive license. This meant Microsoft retained the right to sell MS-DOS to any other personal computer manufacturer. IBM's legal team did not catch this, or if they caught it, they did not understand what it would mean. Within 2 years, IBM's PC design had been reverse engineered. Clone manufacturers, Compaq, Tandy, and dozens of others began building IBM-compatible machines. They were cheaper. They were competitive. They sold by the millions. Every single one of them needed an operating system. Every single one of them needed MS-DOS. Every copy paid Microsoft a royalty. IBM received nothing from the clone market it had inadvertently made possible. This is not a minor business detail. This is the single most consequential contract oversight in the history of the technology industry. IBM created the personal computer market and then, through one missed clause, handed control of its economics to Microsoft. Gates had negotiated that clause deliberately. He was 25 years old and he understood what IBM's lawyers did not, that the real value was not in selling to IBM. The real value was in selling to every company that copied IBM, and there would be many. Meanwhile, Gary Kildall watched what happened next. IBM did eventually offer CP/M on its personal computer, alongside PC-DOS, but it priced CP/M at $240. PC-DOS was $40. Both ran on the same machine. Kildall's superior, established, widely supported operating system had been priced out of its own market. And there is something forensic about what happened next that even Kildall himself never fully accepted. Something the evidence forces us to say honestly. And we will get to that. Because the truth of this story is more complicated than a simple theft, and in some ways, that makes it worse. In 2022, IEEE Spectrum, the flagship publication of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, published a forensic software analysis comparing MS-DOS directly against CP/M. The conclusion? QDOS was not copied from CP/M. MS-DOS showed no signs of code theft. Gary Kildall believed for the rest of his life that his work had been stolen. He said so publicly. He wrote about it. The belief ate at him. And the forensic record, assembled decades after his death, says he was wrong about that specific claim. But here is what the forensic record does not change. What was taken from Gary Kildall was not his code. It was his market. CP/M's API, its application programming interface, the set of rules that let software communicate with the OS, was deliberately replicated in QDOS so that CP/M software could run on it. That was the design intent. Patterson said so openly. And that deliberate compatibility meant that the thousands of software titles written for CP/M could, with minimal adjustment, run on the cheaper Microsoft product. The installed base Kildall had spent years building became, in effect, a sales argument for the product that replaced him. He was not robbed in a courtroom sense. He was outmaneuvered in a conference room. Gary Kildall sold digital research to Novell in 1991. He spent the early 1990s working on a memoir he never finished. He withdrew from the industry he had helped create. Friends described a man who could not reconcile the scale of what had happened to him with the absence of any formal acknowledgement that it had happened at all. On July 8, 1994, Gary Kildall died at the age of 52. He fell and suffered a concussion. A fatal heart attack followed. He died before his memoir was complete. Before any public reckoning with what he had built and what had been done with it. He had invented the BIOS, the firmware layer in every personal computer ever made. He had built the operating system architecture that defined the industry. And he died with almost none of the public recognition that architecture deserved. Tim Patterson is still alive. He has given interviews over the years. He has said more than once that he has no significant regrets. He was a programmer. He was not a businessman. He built something in 4 months that he never imagined would matter beyond the walls of Seattle Computer Products. The fact that it became the foundation of a $3 trillion company is not something he could have foreseen or prevented. He made approximately $20 million in total from the downstream value of his work, through a later venture and a stake he eventually sold. That is not nothing. It is also not a fraction of what that work produced. Bill Gates became the richest person on Earth for years, and the official history of how he got there does not include Gary Kildall or Tim Patterson in any prominent way. Microsoft did not steal code. The forensic evidence is clear on that. QDOS was independently written. MS-DOS was not CP/M with the labels changed. Kildall's belief that it was understandable, human, and emotionally coherent was not supported by the technical record. Bill Gates was not a criminal. He was an extraordinarily skilled negotiator operating in an era when the rules of the software industry were being written in real time. The non-exclusive clause in the IBM contract was not fraud. It was contract draftsmanship. IBM's lawyers should have caught it. They did not. The pricing decision on CP/M is harder to defend. Microsoft worked with IBM to price CP/M at 6 times the cost of PC-DOS. If you believe the market should decide, Then the market decided. If you believe that pricing a competitor's product out of existence when you have no better technical argument is anti-competitive, then you have a case. No court ever ruled on this specifically. What the pessimistic reading of this story says is that Microsoft built its empire not through superior technology, but through superior deal-making. QDOS was described by its own creator as quick and dirty. It was functional, not exceptional. CP/M was more mature, more stable, more widely supported. The product that won was not the better product. It was the cheaper product, made cheaper by deliberate pricing strategy, not by engineering achievement. What the optimistic reading says is that Gates understood something Kildall did not. That in a new market, distribution and pricing are technology. That a deal is a product. That controlling the licensing terms on an operating system is more valuable than writing the best operating system. And that this insight, whatever you think of its ethics, is also a legitimate form of competitive intelligence. Both readings are defensible. What is not defensible is the erasure. Gary Kildall's name is not in Microsoft's history. Tim Patterson's name is not in Microsoft's history. The company that benefited most directly from both of their work has never formally acknowledged the debt. That is not a legal obligation, but it is a historical fact. And history is what this channel is here to tell. At the start of this video, we referred to a number, $50,000, paid in 1981 for the code at the core of a $3 trillion company, paid to a man who didn't know who was buying, for a product that replaced a man who didn't get to negotiate the terms of his own displacement. Gary Kildall invented the BIOS. He built CP/M. He laid the conceptual foundation for everything that followed. He died at 52 in 1994, without his memoir finished, without an industry acknowledgement of what he had contributed, without his name in the history that his work made possible. Tim Patterson built QDOS in 4 months. He sold it for $50,000 to a buyer who never told him the truth about the deal. He has said he has no significant regrets. Maybe that is the only sane response. Neither of these men erased themselves. Someone made that decision for them, and the company that made it is still the most powerful software business in the world. Think about what that means. Every time you have opened a Windows machine, every update, every forced migration, every time Microsoft told you that you had no choice, that chain began with a $50,000 check written to a man who didn't know who was buying. It began with a pricing decision that made a better product unaffordable. It began with a contract clause that IBM's lawyers missed and Gates's lawyers did not. You were never just a customer. You were the downstream consequence of decisions made in 1981 by people whose names you were never supposed to learn. Now you know them. Subscribe if this kind of history matters to you.